Folks, today is also September 11th, and it was 16 years ago when this nation and the world was stunned by the terror attacks that took place in New York City as well as Washington, D.C., and of course one of the planes that went down in Pennsylvania. More than 3,000 people died, including hundreds of police officers and firefighters. 19 terrorists associated with Al-Qaeda carried out the attacks, most of them from Saudi Arabia. Of course, many of us remember exactly where we were when those planes flew into the World Trade Centers in New York City, sending burning debris into the streets below, and hundreds jumped from the lives. Now, speaking of losing their lives, many of those first responders have dealt with major health issues, many of them dying far too soon as a result of what took place on that day. Now, keep in mind, all across New York City today, as well as the Pentagon and Pennsylvania, there will be remembrances of the folks who were killed on that particular day. It changed America, but it's also changed how we confront terrorism. Let's talk about that with our guest. Of course, he has spent 30-plus years in the United States Army. Lieutenant General John Morgan, retired former commander of the 2nd Infantry Division, served in multiple leadership roles in the U.S. Army as well. And General Morgan, on this day, again, we remember those who lost their lives, but also we deal with the reality that we are still engaging in a war in Afghanistan as a result of what took place. We took our eyes off of the ball, if you will, going into Iraq as opposed to focusing on Afghanistan. From a military standpoint, have we learned the lessons from that day?
I believe that we have. I believe that we have learned the lessons in terms of security to the nation and the kinds of things that we need to put in place to ensure that America is safe from terrorism. And let me say that when we talk about safety, we're talking about something that's very, very broad, and I'm not saying that terrorist attacks won't happen. But the things that we put in place, Roland, to include increased intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities, the ability to get out in front of terrorist networks and groups, to combat them in their planning cycle, to defeat them before they're able to bring the kinds of attacks that we saw on September 11th back here to the United States. It is an evolving threat. As we take actions, they react, and then we counteract to their actions. And it's a continuing effort to ensure the safety of the American people, our nation, and people around the world that are part of our interest.
Well, it's still stunning to so many people in terms of how this could happen. And if we think about it, I mean, look, we had never had anything to that extent happen on American soil. And for many of us, folks were rather lax, if you will, about where we were in terms of our airports, in terms of our infrastructure up until that point.
Well, think about the things that have been put in place since 9/11. We now have a Director of National Intelligence. We now have a Homeland Security Department. All of those things have been put in place after lessons that come out of the 9/11 Commission and other studies that have gone on to ensure what are the things that we need to put in place to protect ourselves against not only the kind of terrorist attack we saw on 9/11, but then also I would tell you cyber terrorism. The military in particular has put a number of different cyber commands into play. U.S. Cyber Command is now stood up to deal with cyber threats and cyber terrorism. Bioterrorism. The military monitors that very, very closely. As a former planner on the Joint Staff and in J5, during my time, I was the director of Middle East Africa policy as we led into 9/11. I can tell you that the interagency process and the work that goes through in the national security apparatus thinks about a lot of these potential actions every single day. And the work that goes on with our National Security Advisor to ensure that these efforts are brought forward is something that the U.S. government focuses on, and that comes out of what happened on 9/11.
Today's 9/11. I guess, you know, my one question, I guess I would ask, do you think we will, I guess it can be said that Saudi Arabia played some role in the execution of 9/11. Do you think we'll ever get to a point where we'll be able to hold them accountable for the role that they played in 9/11?
And remember, the Supreme Court, first of all, there's a lawsuit right now, and the Supreme Court is allowed to move forward to sue the government of Saudi Arabia. General, go ahead.
You know, whatever is going on in that law case, you know, that will be something the U.S. government will have to deal with in terms of how we decide we're going to hold a particular nation accountable for its actions. We have taken the necessary steps at those individuals, I would say, that were responsible for carrying out terrorist attacks. Many of them obviously died on that day, but those that were part of the planning effort, we have aggressively gone after them and pursued them to bring them to justice. And I would tell you that in the terms of the individuals that conduct terror threats against the United States will continue to go after them with tremendous vigor.
We'll go to Lauren in a second for a question. Shall I go to my iPad, folks? This is a live feed. If you go to the 9/11 Memorial and Museum website at 8:40 this morning, in about 30 minutes, the ceremony will begin to, of course, dedicate. And they typically what they do is they actually read the names of all the folks who died on that particular day. And so there's a live stream of that as well. And so go to their website. You can actually see that. Lauren, go ahead.
Do you think we've been lucky that we haven't been attacked since 9/11, or do you think it's been policy design?
Well, sometimes I'd rather be lucky than good. But with that said, I think that we have put policies in place. Again, this is a cross the entire government interagency process. It's not just about the military. It's about our policy process. It's about exercising all the elements, again, of national power to ensure that we reduce the threat of terrorism on U.S. soil. And it's an ongoing process. Again, I would want to remind you that the threat evolves. It studies us, it watches us, it looks for vulnerabilities, and we have to be responsive to their counteractions. And I think that entire government process is at work and continues to work to try to keep America safe.
All right, General Morgan, we surely appreciate it. Thanks a bunch.
Weekdays on TV One.
I will never lie to you.
Oh my God.
Roland Martin.
He doesn't want to talk to us. He wants to ignore us.
Uncensored.
Hell no.
That ain't gonna cut it, boo.
Unapologetic.
No, that is fundamentally false. You are wrong.
Unfiltered.
He wants an America where we all look alike. He ain't talking about black people.
Unrelenting.
You better go work out, because you got a fight on your hands.
NewsOne Now with Roland Martin. Weekdays at 7 a.m. on TV One.